yeah, I'm going to be focusing on sort of racial capitalism and imperialism, mostly in this sort. So yeah, to varying extents, as I said, it seems obvious that capitalism is. This is proceeding with the a base level assumption that capitalism is causing the climate crisis. But to just go into that a little bit, the profit motive is really at the heart of capitalism, and production is oriented around profit, the production of commodities, rather than social need. So even at like the lowest level explanation, you can see there that on a planet with finite resources and a system that pursues infinite growth, there's going to be spillover effects on the environment, because of the fact that short-term profits are pursued over everything else. And so yeah, that's a very simple. I don't think that's really contestable, at least. If anybody has any questions on whether or not they think capitalism is driving the climate crisis, then they can interject or ask. But I think we'll proceed. So specifically thinking about how capitalism has not just shaped class relations, but also different categories through which our experience of climate change is actually lived. So thinking about these in terms of like race, gender, nationality, and how capitalism has influenced those factors which actually determine how we live the climate crisis. And then another thing I'm going to talk about is how mainstream narratives about climate change obscure the roots of the climate crisis and obstruct necessary action, something we see a lot today. As I said, like proceeded with an assumption that capitalism is driving the climate crisis, but want to see it sort of go into how exactly that's obscured, and hopefully conclude with the idea that climate crisis can only be overcome through a sort of a blend of anti-capitalist, anti-imperialist, feminist, anti-colonial and decolonial praxis. And hopefully, yeah, we'll get into those a bit more as we get onto the questions. You can change slide, thank you. So I was thinking about a definition of capitalism through which we could sort of understand how capitalism is at the heart of the climate crisis, but not one that reduces it simply to capitalism is simply when some people own stuff and some people don't own stuff, and then people are forced to work for a wage, and then some people sell stuff or own the means of production, because it doesn't really give you a holistic understanding of what it really is when we talk about capitalism and how capitalism actually exists in practices. So got this definition here from a book called How the West Came to Rule by Alexander Nivas and Kerem Nisonoglu, which is capitalism is best understood as a set of configurations, assemblages or bundles of social relations and processes oriented around the systematic reproduction of the capital relation, but not reducible either historically or logically to that relation alone. So it's not worth thinking about capitalism as just simply the presence of markets or the presence of capital, but everything in the world system which capitalism influences, and influences capitalism such that the reproduction of the capital relation is possible. And by this, it means that, again, like simply dividing things by class is not a good way of understanding how capitalism works, because it's going to exclude how different relationships and social relations actually allow the capital relation to function and for it to be reproduced. For example, race and the differentiation of populations, or gender and social reproduction, for example, that even allows productive labor to happen in the first place. So understanding all these different relations and their relationship to capitalism is key really for understanding how the climate crisis has been caused, as well as how it's actually having effects right now on different populations. So these things like capitalist, proletarian, I've used proletarian instead of working class because of the connotations that working actually has within global capitalism, because increasingly we see today that it's not actually a straight up division between capitalists and the laborers, but the capitalists and people without capital, because there's actually a lot of people especially nowadays, that are completely excluded from the wage and from labour. And increasingly, you see this in the global south, and you see that as one of the ways through which people are disproportionately affected by climate change. Other relationships: core periphery, metropole colony, white supremacy, racism, patriarchy, etc. So yeah, the climate crisis has different effects across different populations and geographies based on their relation to and role within the capitalist world system, based on these constructed categories which capitalism influences. But while we think about this, it's important to recognize that we can't reduce things like white supremacy, like patriarchy, like even state formation, for example. We can't reduce them just to capitalism. They have histories and existences preceding and outside of that. I think one of the big things people talk about is like capitalism and racism, and how like racism helps capitalism. And I think I'll go into it a bit more about the origins of racism, but it's also important to note things like racism, patriarchy, they have their own like affective force outside of like capitalism, and they actually even serve as like organizing logics in their own right, that in the sense that like in some cases patriarchy or racism is actually more important than to certain actors than the accumulation of profit. So yeah, the mainstream discourse about climate change, scientific and political, it's gained a lot of traction in the scientific community. Is based on this idea of the Anthropocene, which is this era in geological history, which is sort of claimed by scientists to be essentially like they frame it as humans rose to prominence and began destroying the earth, and it rests on this human nature binary and this idea of so the human nature binary as in humanity separated and from in a different sphere from nature, as if we don't exist within nature, and our social relations aren't shaped fundamentally by our relationship with nature and within nature. And then it also rests on this idea of a universal humanity, which is equally responsible for the causes of climate change. It's very sort of useful, and it makes sense that it's prominent in these like liberal scientific communities, because ultimately it's devoid of any political economy, any analysis of climate change that actually brings in the difficult questions about how society is organized. And this has consequences in terms of how we conceptualize and think about the solutions to climate change. And mainly this is like neo-Malthusianism and eco-fascism, where people talk about it's a sort of anti-humanist perspective that ultimately obviously has racist effects when people are talking about things like overpopulation, not understanding the power dynamics behind that. So the Anthropocene approach is actually very dangerous in terms of like how we conceptualize the social and geological crises which we're facing. So instead, we should look at the current sort of era of history as the Capitalocene, an era which has been shaped by the rise of capital across history, as a geosocial force that shapes nature and our relationships within and to it. And ultimately, it only makes sense to analyze the shift in the climate and our relationship with the environment with this fundamental change in economic organization. And as sort of spoken about before, the rise of capital is tied up historically with many other relations and processes. So imperialism, colonialism, patriarchy, state formation. And so to understand sort of the history of climate change and how its differentiated effects have been shaped over time, if we want to understand the climate change as being an issue which affects racialized people or affects women or affects people who are under threats of imperialism, we need to understand how capitalism has shaped those categories in the first place, and how how divisions like gender and race have been used to sort of ensure the hegemony of capitalism across time. And this is a process I think it's important to understand, is that when people locate the roots of the climate crisis in 1800, or even people from a left perspective do it and say, oh, with the steam engine or social property relations changing within Europe, there's much more far-reaching roots of how this world has come to be. And I think looking at the rise of capital is a good it serves to crystallize basically a lot of the different factors that sum up basically how the climate crisis is playing out. Slide, thank you. So to understand actually existing capitalism, I think we really need to understand it as racial capitalism. And by this, we mean that capitalism only in practice works through differentiated exploitation by producing and moving through relations of severe inequality between human groups. And this is for two reasons. One, like differential exploitation. So within capitalism, you need people to have different roles, and from those different roles, they have different roles within production, consumption, etc., etc. And so it helps to divide populations so that they can play those roles, but not only so they can play those roles, so that they can play roles and be exposed to differential exploitation without actually threatening capitalist hegemony. So, for example, in terms of the classic example is in labor. So you have like one workforce who is skilled or paid a higher wage, and then you might have another workforce which is unskilled and paid lower wages, and that the dynamics of those different workforce are shaped by race, and race will be the dividing factor which prevents solidarities from being generated from perhaps like the white integrated workforce and a black outsourced workforce. So it serves the purpose of allowing different groups to take up different roles, and then ensuring that they can be differentially exploited without solidarities being formed across different groups. And I think thinking about this on a world system level makes sense even more, because you see that kind of the conditions that people are exposed to in the global south compared to how they are in the global north. It's very evident that there's sort of different levels of exploitation going on. So throughout capitalism history, it's involved expansion and refinement of processes of racialization and the exacerbation of difference. So like geographical and ethnic differences into racial solidified ones, or gender divisions. And this has had a purpose of facilitating dispossession, slavery, exploitation on a global level throughout its history. We can see the rise of especially the concept of race and racism through the early history of capitalism, and the need for colonizers to justify their colonization and their rule over dispossessed people and their integration into the labor process. So a useful way to think about the way that capitalism and imperialism, racial capitalism and imperialism work, is through a constant accumulation by dispossession. So the resources which are being used for value to be extracted from are constantly accumulated through the dispossession of those resources from different groups that aren't as integrated into the capitalist world economy. And you can see this being done through imperialism, colonialism, and neocolonialism. It's something which has characterized capitalism history and its ongoing history throughout its entire existence. Yeah, you can skip forward. So yeah, and when we think about accumulation by dispossession, what we mean is the transformation of private property of land into private property and capital, and the effectively turning natural resources into something which can be exploited. And this is obviously mainly in practice done through militarism, imperialism, um, and through this you have an erasure of indigenous ways of being and knowing, and yeah, so like racialization, for example, and colonization and destructions of like indigenous ways of understanding your relationship to different people, your relationship to gender, your relationship to land, relationship to knowledge, etc., religion, all these things, spirituality, um, and this has had devastating consequences in a climate sense in terms of the destruction of sort of indigenous ways of caring for um, the land, which people have been doing for thousands and thousands of years, um, outside of the capitalist world system. But then when this process of imperialism actually happens, very quickly we can see that they're totally erased and replaced by sort of capitalist extractivism, which seeks to just take as much profit as possible from the land, with complete disregard for these indigenous ways of life. Um, so yeah, basically alongside every single stage of capitalism and this process of accumulation that is so central, especially on a global level, to capitalism, because capitalism has a tendency to universalize. It needs to seek out new markets, new resources to exploit, new labor to exploit, as costs go up. Um, and so, if we look historically, it's very clear. Exploitation of natural resources, it can't all happen in one nation. So, like, it needs to happen on a global level. And ecocide has been a fundamental aspect and consequence of capitalist expansion. And by aspect to consequence of, I mean ecocide is something which is almost deliberately being done in and of itself through imperialism and racial capitalism, i.e., like the purpose is to sever people's connections with the land and transform it into something entirely different. But also, because of the way that capitalism like reorganizes society, it can also destroy the environment as a secondary effect, even if its primary intention is not to do that. You often see with the integration of nations, of economies and societies into capitalism, there's a decreased propensity to essentially care for the environment as the imperatives of profit come before everything else. So typically, capitalism has operated through this combination: cheap nature plus labor equals value and a lot of money, basically. And so, central to how capitalism has been operated has been this exploitation of cheap nature that is available because of the power relations that exist within the world system, afforded by things like colonialism and imperialism, and those power relations, which shaped over the course of 600 years, are still evident today, and allow that sort of those unequal power relations to happen. They allow capitalist states and corporations to go up to different countries and set trade agreements so that they're able, or deals with international institutions so that they're able to go in and exploit and dispossess people of their land and take their resources and change environmental regulations, etc., etc. So really, imperialism is central to understanding, like, on a global level, how we see these like differentiated effects of climate change. And so, yeah, at every stage of capitalist development, um, this ecocide, it's always taken place, from the colonization of Americas to the enslavement of Africans to imperial monopoly accumulation, imperial social democracy to neoliberal finance led growth. It's always these same processes of imperialism, destruction of indigenous ways of living, the integration of those peoples who've been sort of colonized and dispossessed into the labor force. Although it's important to note that this isn't the case. This isn't the case in all um, examples of colonialism. For example, like settler colonialism, often the intention is to exclude people from the labor force, and then we can still see this as a capitalist-driven climate crisis when we have like the destruction of indigenous relationships with nature, and in some senses, for example, in Palestine, it's even worse when people are not even integrated into the market or the wage. They're simply dispossessed from their land. It's destroyed without actually even having the opportunity to benefit from the gains of capitalism. But yeah, so these processes, imperialism, destruction, proletarianization, and the exploitation of nature, that really characterizes how capitalism has operated on a global scale since its inception, really. And even Marx and Engels could see this to an extent in terms of like what was happening with ecosystems and soil. Yeah. So as said, as illustrated, as many people know, racialized people are already at the forefront of dispossession, disaster, exposure to death. The overwhelming majority of the current effects of the climate crisis are felt by people in the global south. I think it's something like 400,000 deaths a year currently. 98% of those are in developed or underdeveloped countries, and 83% of those are in the countries which are in the category of the least emissions. So we can already see that because of these big spillover effects, because of the fact that countries in the global north consume and exploit so much without regard for the social needs of people outside, that it's going to have racialized effects basically, and then we can see how it also has gendered effects in how the burden of care and social reproduction massively disproportionately affects women in dealing with disasters and the implications of the climate crisis, with things like a decrease in food, a decrease in available land to work on, a decrease in water, and then obviously physical care when climate disaster is actually happening, and obviously class directly affects your exposure to the effects of climate change, whether we're thinking about it on an international level within your position, within global production, or even also within your own nation. I don't think it's not usually useful to like to understand capitalism and class on a national level, because capitalism is an international system, and production is global. So when we talk about like the English working class is like in the top 5% of the global population. But nonetheless, even though people are in the working class in the imperial core are privileged relative to workers in the global south, it's still very clear that their class position affects how exactly you are affected by climate change. And yeah, we can see this by, for example, like the effects of climate change on air pollution, and who exactly is exposed to air pollution in terms of like where they live, whether or not it's being rectified. So yeah, we can see how there's differential effects basically of the climate crisis based on your position, and there's other things like geography and nationality as well. And I think it's important to note here, like these experiences, all within capitalism, they sort of speak to a quote by Stuart Hall when he said, "Race is the modality through which class is lived." Because ultimately your experience of capitalism, of production, consumption, and the way that it shapes your life is not just shaped by class in the way that some like class reductionists would tell you, but also literally your race and how that means that you might be exposed to death, or integrated into production in a certain way because it allows them to divide it. So when we're thinking about these sort of international imperial effects of climate change across the world, for me personally, migration is the thing which I think about the most, because for me, it really crystallizes so many issues within the climate crisis and within capitalism, and it can serve as like a focal point for understanding a lot of these issues. The climate crisis at its heart is something which is exposing people to death and suffering and the destruction of their ways of life. And it's important to recognize that this is not a future tense thing. As we said in the event earlier this week, the climate crisis is already there, is already here. It's already been destroying people's homes. It's already been killing hundreds of thousands, millions of people, and condemning them to terrible living conditions. And fundamentally, never before have we really seen anything which has had such an impact, or at least something which cannot be like attributed to direct, visible human relations, that has actually had like will have such a devastating cost on people, basically, like aside from war. So what we're going to basically see is movement. That's basically what I'm trying to say. People will move away from their homes as a result of how they've been dispossessed, how they've been exploited, etc., as these places become unlivable because of the effects of climate change. Not to delve too much, I don't want to go into data, etc., or predictions too much, but we're already on track for like 3.5 to 4 degrees of warming, and the consequences on that, on like food supplies, and on things like heat waves, other natural disasters, is going to be disastrous, even by 2050, 2100. So we're going to see huge amounts of movement away from where people have lived. And the concept to understand this that is important is broader imperialism, which was, I think it was Harshawala who theorized it, which is the entrenchment and re-entrenchment of controls against migrants who are displaced as a result of the violences of capitalism and imperialism, and subsequently forced into precarious labor, or, this is my addition, exclusion or expulsion as a result of state legislation and systemic social hierarchies. And so broader imperialism is already something which has constantly functioned throughout capitalism's history, throughout its history of ecocide, throughout its history of exploitation, destruction, and exclusion of people from subsistence and like basic ways of life. And we can see this, for example, in how the way that the borders of this country operate. This country colonized most of the world, and then its wealth, the wealth that exists within this nation, has been plundered through capitalist imperialism, essentially. However, the colonized subjects whose nations have been pillaged, exploited, and destroyed through imperialism, through these processes which have taken hundreds of years, but also very recent processes such as like war in the Middle East. When they try to come here, then they're met with utter violence in ways that we can't even imagine as people with more secure forms of citizenship. And borders are here basically a way to preserve structures of imperialism and leave them unrectifiable, essentially, to individuals who are seeking to sort of go back on and seek justice for the former crimes of colonial nations. And it's important to recognise as well, especially in the context of the UK, and this is important going forward in when we're talking about climate refugees as well, is that the British Empire, at the myth at the heart of it was equality. It was that Britain was the motherland, and that people should, because it was the motherland, people have the right to come here. They gave everyone citizenship in 1948 in order to try and preserve the empire, by saying, oh, everyone has a share. Everyone actually does have a share in this empire. You can all come here and enjoy it because it's the motherland, blah, blah, blah. And then when they realized, oh, we actually hate black and brown people, then like 20 years later, they started shutting the borders. So, and this is not something that's limited to the UK, but also it's important to, I think, look at the EU, something which is people don't look at enough. And I think when we look at the climate crisis especially, it's very, very important to look at the EU and the policy of Fortress Europe, which is essentially the EU's border policy, in collaboration with non-European states to prevent African and Middle Eastern migrants from reaching the coast of Europe. People let the EU off way too easily, because thousands and thousands, I think it's over 25,000, it's possibly a lot more, migrants have died now, as a result of Fortress Europe. And I think the most important thing to think of here is how certain scholarship has like linked a lot of unrest that led to the Arab Spring to like low food yields, that potentially can be attributed to the climate crisis. So when we look at literally how exactly Fortress Europe is operating and how these borders are operating, it is already serving to dispossess and exclude people who are feeling the effects of climate change. So, and just in general, we can see across the world that increasingly rich nations in the global north are going through a process of what I'd call borderization. So essentially bordering themselves up, securing themselves against the idea of an external threat. Some people attribute this to like the crisis of capitalism within the states, but I think it's more useful to understand it as the rise of nationalism and reaction, just in general, partly as a response to capitalism and the fact that it can't actually deliver the growth and improve quality of life that actually it claims to be able to, or that it did in the past. And so myths about that can lead to unity and hegemony of the capitalist system, like nationalism, for example, become more and more powerful when it becomes obvious that people aren't actually going to get. It's not possible to simply satisfy and placate people by paying them higher wages, because those higher wages, they don't exist. Everybody's being suppressed through like globalized capitalism. So yeah, and this is a process which is already taking place. So we're not at the beginning of the climate crisis, but we're beginning of our understanding of the climate crisis and seeing how it's having effects on people. And so this is something which really worries me going forward, because of how fundamentally the issue with climate change is destruction, and how destruction will lead to movement, and movement is going to be mediated through the people's relationships within capitalism. People are going to try to move to places which are more equipped to deal with climate change, to places which have higher wages, to places where they can find better living conditions. So I think this is going to be one of the primary crises that we see going forwards, and it is really a crisis of capitalism, and how capitalist nation states and their reactionary nature sort of shape the world in this way and divide us along these arbitrary lines, despite our sort of interconnectedness, and will really actually, that sort of, the presence of nationalism is really going to lead to an extreme amount of violence coming forward. So in terms of dealing with the climate crisis, there's a lot of like debates about whether or not capitalism is able to deal with the climate crisis, and the typical response from people who are critical of capitalism is that it can't. And so like green neoliberalism is the example, like the idea that like somehow the market itself and just technology is going to lead to us dealing with the problem of climate change as it becomes cheaper to transition to renewable energy, etc., etc. Capitalism has led to like individualizing solutions, people thinking that consumer solutions are the way forward, like turning lights off and nonsense like that. The capitalism also, alongside this idea of individual solutions, the death of society, which neoliberalism has caused, the idea that we have social responsibilities, relationships that actually do exist outside of the market. And I think does have big implications in how people understand the climate crisis, and how exactly capitalism has shaped people's values and ideologies to determine what exactly they see as a problem or something that they see as having a solution which they're responsible for. So these are major limitations to, and obviously production for profit is a big limitation. All these things like really hinder how capitalism can deal with it. But the question is whether it is to what extent this actually means they'll be unable at a fundamental level to deal with the crisis. Because what we really mean when we say capitalism can't deal with the climate crisis is we mean capitalism is unable at delivering climate justice. The climate crisis is something which is happening, and ultimately capitalism is something which exists. So what the question I have really is, how will capitalist governance look when the effects of climate change are they're not ignorable by countries in the global north, when disaster actually finally hits the shores of countries like the UK? Because obviously it's not just the resources that these countries have as a result of capitalism and imperialism, which they have obviously been driving the climate crisis with. They also tend to, I guess it's because of, to an extent, geographical luck, but tend to have like less proximity to the effects of the climate crisis and global warming, etc. And obviously, of course, like if we're talking about environmental degradation at a fundamental level, they absolutely have less proximity to that, because all of that is being exported to other places where that ecocide can be carried out so that the value can be extracted. And that's something which is increasingly recognized by capitalist states and corporations, that environmental degradation is a bad thing, but it's not bad as long as it doesn't happen here, basically. So yeah, I don't think capitalism is incapable of dealing with the climate crisis. It definitely is able to deal with the climate crisis, but it's at what cost will it be able to deal with the climate crisis, essentially. So though it's caused by like capitalism need to generate short-term profits, etc., it's still possible for this system to continue in light of ecological disaster, in light of all the social consequences that climate change will happen. Just because states in the global north are so imperialist, basically, and so able to insulate themselves from the effects of climate change, they're equipped like. I guess you can argue neoliberalism has stripped the state out and left it a little unable to deal with like social problems. We can see this during COVID, for example. But when it comes to it, when this country is faced with climate change, and other countries like the USA, for example, what is more likely to see is a reinforcement of border imperialism, of racism, and of reaction, basically, in order to deal with the fact that there is this disaster. This disaster is happening, but I think we underestimate the extent to which capitalism is hegemonic, in some senses, because it's just not as easy as thinking that, oh, this crisis is going to lead to people hating capitalism and then they overthrow it. Because when people have such strong affiliation to things like nationalism, to things like white supremacy, then it's clear that people actually are willing to take material damage to their living standards because of their identification with this wider structure that isn't necessarily economic. And so you could see a situation whereby capitalism there isn't as much ability to open new frontiers and exploit nature, which is resulting in less growth, poorer wages, as well as all the disruption climate disaster will cause, which will disrupt production. And all these things will have a negative impact on the economy, but they don't necessarily mean that capitalism will just go away. And yeah, ultimately, it doesn't mean capitalism will go away. It'll take a lot more than that. It's a system which has a high degree of hegemony, to the point of where people can't really even, as Mark Fisher said, like can't even conceive of an alternative outside of it. So the interconnected nature of globalized capitalism basically means like a nation state centric view of the climate crisis, where we look at like individual nations and their solutions to it and solving the climate crisis here and blah 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 blah. It's just not useful. The problems are global and the solutions are global, and there's no real way that at any individual nation state level any state is capable of dealing with the climate crisis. And I'd even argue this goes for like the USA and other imperialist nations, just because the nature of capitalism is that capital is in the driving seat. It's not people or corporations as such. It's the logic driving it, really. So ultimately, we need to look at the global system of capital and how it reproduces itself if we're looking at solutions to the climate crisis. So yeah, that's the conclusion basically. The problem is capitalism. Thank you very much. So we got some questions now. I think I spoke for too long, but there's some interesting questions here. If I guess we can run through, or yeah, we can run through. So if anybody wants to pick up on any of these questions, basically fire away. Start with the first one. If anybody has something to say about the first one, then yeah. But if not, just feel free to go on to any of the other ones. And there's another page as well.
Also, even though like this is being recorded, the discussion part won't be included in the SU website, so like you can say anything. Yeah, and also if you want to put your hands up, I can't really see people's hands. I did want to say though, like on the last slide when we were talking about the effects of the climate crisis kind of reaching to the global north and people realizing that we can already see even in like North America, with like the Dakota Access Pipeline and like just constant exploitation of Native American land. You can kind of see how even internally it well, like obviously it's environmental racism, but they're using the climate crisis as like a form of biological warfare. So it suits their needs to obviously, because the people who are affected the most by climate crisis in America are Black and Indigenous people. They are the most affected by air pollution, and people, especially in like working class areas, are seeing like the building of like this pipeline that is so bad for the environment. So yeah, you can kind of see how it still benefits like their interest in building these kinds of things.
Ade?
I say the first one, overpopulation is a narrative that people like, that mainstream media and other mainstream political forces like to use to explain climate change. And like that obviously universalizes the problem because it makes it kind of shares responsibility for climate change as though it's like this crisis of human populations, rather than like as you said, a crisis of capitalism. And then yeah, that's really it. Overpopulation.
Yeah, I think that's important. I think it's the fact that it's so devoid, like Anthropocene logic is so like devoid of any understanding of like power relations. Even when you think about overpopulation, you can't divorce an analysis of population from the fact that people are integrated within capitalism, and therefore the family structures which people have are influenced by their economic situation. Naomi?
Yeah, I feel like maybe the mainstream narratives universalize climate change and its causes, but in a way to disguise the actual underlying causes, which is basically like what kind of reproduces the harmful behaviors, is that like, yes, environmentalism is becoming mainstream, but in a way that makes people like that focuses our attention elsewhere so that people don't necessarily challenge the underlying power dynamics that cause it.
Yeah, liberalism is a disease, basically. The question I was gonna ask, I didn't really write it out properly, but so the second question, is there any truth or value in individual consumer solutions? It's something we talk about a lot. Like, you know, people say, oh, if you recycle, if you turn lights off, if you eat sustainably, if you go vegan, you can do something to affect climate change. And like, obviously, we've just spoken about how, and I've just ranted about how like climate change is caused by imperialism and capitalism and like these huge global processes. So like we often disregard completely like any consumer individual solutions, no, because it's systemic. But then is there any truth in the idea that or value in the idea that our consumption and individual patterns of behavior do need to change? And this is mainly in light of an understanding that I think what people are unwilling to accept or confront is that it is fundamentally true that in the imperial core, we overconsume. We consume hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of times more energy than people in the global south do. So like while we do poo-poo like these individual consumer solutions because we think, okay, they can't be effective, and in a sense like us doing those things on an individual scale won't, but do individual and consumer habit changes, do they have a role at some level in dealing with the climate crisis, or is it a totally useless approach? Ade, Danish.
Yeah, I say like, well, firstly, capitalist productivity is really overvalued in the West. And so like our wages are higher and we have like in general, and we have like social safety nets and all that sort of stuff. And all of those things are a result, like wealth is stolen from the global south for various reasons. And one of those reasons is to allow for concessions for like Western workers, to create cleavages amongst workers, to create things like labor aristocracy and all those different ideas. And so if we're talking about like regardless like climate change included, if we're talking about ending the global division of labor, ending imperialism, all that sort of stuff, then part of that would have to be about redistribution and what that would look like on a massive scale. And then also parts of like how people's individual problems in the West like often become, because when you think about what cleaning is, like if you've ever cleaned your house and you're deeping it, a lot of cleaning is actually just moving, it's displacement, right? When you're cleaning up your house, you're moving things from one place to another. Oftentimes you're not getting rid of anything. And so when you think about it in that way, the things that we produce, excess waste, it's not that it's just you can just get rid of it when you throw it away. It goes somewhere. And like there's whole things like waste imperialism where like Western countries leverage their position over poorer countries and basically get them, oh yeah, like we're gonna pay you to like house our waste basically. So and then you can think about all the other different things that comes into play. So like when it does come to individuals, like it does kind of become an issue when you think about individual people's consumptions. And then when you add on to that, you talked about fast fashion. You talk about the raw materials that go into various different like technological things. And even like I saw this tweet that's random, like on Bitcoin and like the energy taken to like complete a blockchain, something like that. And then there was lots of critiques in the comments, like people like, oh, you don't know what you're talking about. So let me not actually bring up that example, but it's just like to like add the point, like to package the point, which is basically like, yes, I think there's lots of truth in individual changes, in changes to individual consumption habits. But that obviously comes within the context of a collective, which is Western society. And so then it becomes collective concerns with individual ramifications, regardless of how you look at it. And any attempt to place all blame on corporations, to me, seems like chauvinism, because it's like, to who are they advertising these things? Who is are buying these products? To who, like, your buy is this economics is exchange, it's resources changing hands. Like, who is involved in those processes? Let's actually break it down. And like a lot of the time, it's me and you. You know what I mean? So like, yeah.
Ish.
Yeah, this is somewhat kind of just saying a similar thing to what Adi just said, but basically, like, yeah, you might kind of say that like Western overconsumption is an issue, but so in some ways that there might be some things you can do as an individual, but the whole point, I think, should be kind of reconfiguring our agency and power as individuals. And it's not, we don't have power as consumers, like that's a myth, and that's the way we've been conditioned to understand our position within like a capitalist world system. But looking at things like overconsumption in the West, it's like a structural problem and basically the agency we should be looking for isn't through consumption, but individuals organizing together for collective solutions. So basically we need to like completely understand how, like, reconfigure and re-understand how we can make change. But like buying, I don't know, organic Oatly milk or something, I don't know, that's not going to really do much. But yeah, it's basically change our understandings of agency. Consumer problems are the product of structural issues, so that's how we should understand it.
So
yeah, I was going to say, like, if we're being radically pragmatic with the way that we imagine a liberated, like, green future, then our individual consumption and our individual consumption habits as they stand no longer exist. Like, that's just something that doesn't exist in a liberated future. So it's important that we pay attention to how the world will look on an individual level, as well as a structural level in this new imagined future. But I think the problem at the moment with the way that we have focused or the way that we have imagined individualism is that we see it as the sum total of our activism, or that people see it as the sum total of their activism, that I drink Oatly milk and I turn off my lights and I recycle. And so that's all that I need to do. I think a really good example of that is like that vegan teacher on TikTok, like thinking that being like just her veganism alone is the sum total of her activism, whilst also like being an intensely problematic racist person, but carrying on as if she in her individual veganism is like saving the world. But yeah.
is it worth going on to the other slide quickly, or should we wrap it up? Okay.
We can, yeah.
So some more questions here. How do we show solidarity to different struggles in different parts, to ecological struggles in different parts of the world? How might capitalist states in the global north deal with the climate crisis when their hands are forced, in whichever way, like technologically, socially, blah blah blah? How do we like deal with like race, gender, and class when we're looking at like how the effects of the climate crisis are played out? Like, what is primary? Is it resisting imperialism or capitalism, or is it patriarchy and racism, etc.? How can we resist imperialism and militarism, and like what is to be done? So if anyone's got any thoughts.
I think I was gonna like provide some ideas for the second question. I just can't see like any kind of like solution in which like any capitalist states in the global north will actually deal with the climate crisis, because I think obviously they do rely on the climate crisis in some way to carry on with their imperialism in the global south. But like what we've seen so far, like what we've seen, like oh, we need to do this by 2030, or setting all these like different goals of like carbon neutrality, for example. And I personally just think it's a way of just like procrastination, like, oh, we'll set these goals in like the future. Who knows if we'll get to it? Who knows if, especially countries in the global south whose facilities we are actively taking away and exploiting, they probably won't reach carbon neutrality, but maybe we will. Or in other forms, we've seen like greenwashing of oil and gas companies, and even like right now with like COVID, these are all like indications of the climate crisis, and we've seen how the government is currently reacting to COVID. And I don't know, like I can't really see any kind of optimistic way for a capitalist state to deal with the climate crisis without that capitalist state honestly being destroyed.
Yeah, I think that's definitely interesting. Like, I think like a fundamental thing is like the capitalist states are primarily, because of the way like elections work, etc. They're focused on like short-term growth and profits. So like all these targets, they don't mean it. Like the Tories are going to miss their target by like 50 years. They don't give a fuck. Like they're not going to be alive when even like when people of their position would feel the effects, they will be long dead. So, but yeah, I think just more in terms of like how, if capitalism still exists, will it deal with climate change? The other thing I think that you said was important was actually climate change will leave nations more exposed to imperialism. And like I think about like the idea about like disaster capitalism in this sense, and how like climate change will definitely leave nations more exposed and weak to further exploitation by imperialists. Yes, sir.
Yeah, I feel like there'll be a lot of emphasis on technological solutions as potential saviors, but then that just it just expands it to another arena of like inequality and stuff. Like, say some people look to mining asteroids or going colonies on Mars as potential saviors, but then it just shows that I don't know, like it doesn't really solve anything. And like even technological, I don't think it should be understated that technology can be useful. But say like the development of the vaccine was like such a big thing for science, but then countries in the global south won't actually get the vaccine until like many years, and whereas COVID will be ravaging their countries anyway. So like I don't know, I feel like we shouldn't understate the value of technology, but then technology isn't apolitical. Where resources go to solve what problems means, yeah, it's still going to be a mess.
Yeah, I think mess is the best way to describe it. I think that's definitely like because if there's one thing capitalism can do, it's innovate, and that's not necessarily attaching any form of moral connotation to it whatsoever. But like innovation is needed. Like you can make arguments about like, oh, whether it's states doing it or whether it's actually corporations doing it, but like innovation is at the heart of capitalism. So like there is the ability for this system to produce green technology. There's just no incentives at this stage. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, exactly. So like as it innovated all the destructive forms of production, it can also potentially create new ones. But obviously, there's not incentive there because short-term profits come first. But you do like wonder, like at what point will it become? Will they have to say, okay, this climate crisis is having like severe effects on us here, and like what we actually can't pretend like it's not happening anymore and export all the costs of the climate crisis, because it does seem to me that like that will happen before capitalism is abolished. And then what happens basically? Like they're going to have to find a way to deal with it. it on their own and through technology, which I think will be interesting is not the right word, but yeah. Are there any other points on these questions, or any other on the previous questions, or any questions in general? Comments? Ade?
Can you speak more to the third question? As in, like, what were you thinking about when you wrote that question? Like,
so I probably should have explained it a bit better, but basically, like, so I'm thinking of when we like conceive of the climate crisis as like an issue of anti-racism or a feminist issue, for example, like, say we want to deal with that issue, what is primary in the struggle? Should it be dealing with the direct like division there, so like the fact that racialized people are exposed to within their nations, racialized people are exposed primarily to the effects of climate change, or on a feminist approach, for example? Or should we be pure like class struggle? No, we need to overthrow all of capitalism for this to actually have any effect. Like, is it worth mitigating within those structures without like challenging capitalism and imperialism on a global level, or are they like inherently intertwined?
oh, okay, thank you for the clarification. I'm not going to answer that, but I just wanted to know what you meant and all that sort of stuff, which is really interesting. But yeah, no thoughts, brain cells.
Yeah, I mean, my perspective would be that everything is intertwined. That's what I've really been trying to get at. Like, all these different divisions are shaped by they're not reducible to capitalism, but they're also shaped by capitalism. Like, we can't view capitalism as just about like a pure economic way of organizing. Like, it is a bundle of social relations that is centered around the economic, but it has so many different aspects around it. So like the root of the climate crisis is really in like the rise of capital, and so like all the different divisions that have been generated as a result of that rise, they all have to be dealt with collectively as like an overarching project. And that's why I think like using the concept of racial capitalism makes sense, because it talks about how those divisions have been developed. Obviously, it doesn't include gender in the title, but like it's implied that like patriarchy and gender divisions are like also part of that like differentiation that capitalism has. So I think like conceptualizing like this capitalist world system as like a big bundle of different relations makes it easier to understand that all our struggles are intertwined and joint, really, in the way that we need to be dealing with things. And it's very difficult to separate identities out from each other. Yeah. Alex?
I said it's always a lie. So like there was this quote by I read by Silvia Federici today, and it says capitalism will always be racist and sexist because it has to mystify its core contradiction. The core contradiction being the promise of prosperity versus the reality of widespread poverty. And how it mystifies this contradiction is by denigrating the nature of those it exploits. So that could be colonial subjects, women, and the dispossessed. That's the quote. And it's like, I genuinely feel that this will always be a barrier to, like, if we're talking about, it sounds wishy-washy, but like barriers to empathy, and barriers to seeing other people's pain and then taking on as your own. There's so many barriers to that, and like capitalism will always produce these sorts of cleavages, and nationalism as well will always produce these sorts of like differentiations that just don't allow, that always tell us that, oh, these people are this way and those people are that way and all that sort of stuff. And so then it allows for the sorts of like policies that might be positive solutions. So like an intuitive solution for a lot of people, if you ask them what's the cause of climate change, and then they say overpopulation, and they're kind of what's it called, things and like image that comes to mind is images of like excess, superfluousness, disposability, extraness of so many different people, based on the idea that have their nature, which is just dark, blackened, foreign people that just ultimately don't have the same issues in life that we have, which is to find love, to find friendship, to find community, to find joy, to meet their material needs and to flourish. They just can't see that. And so then this will always, I just feel like if we don't talk about the actual emotional, not to say that like talking about the emotional impact of this stuff is politically expedient, because appealing to people's moral sensibilities is really difficult these days, but it's just is always going to be a problem. So dealing with those divisions has to always be a central priority for me. Like, if not, we're just like, what are we going to do?
Yeah, like capitalism operates through these divisions. So like when people talk about, oh, you know, why are you distracting from class struggle? Well, actually, class struggle is being like distracted and obscured by the fact that these divisions actually like exist, and that is the purpose of those divisions, is to obscure like class struggle from capitalists and then people, proletarians, or you know, people who are dispossessed, etc., etc., etc. So like if you don't deal with those divisions, how can you expect you know, people to develop solidarity with people who like, how can you expect like racialized people to develop solidarity, racialized people in the global south to develop solidarity with like workers in the global north who have like exploited them and are racist to them? Like it's not possible basically. So yeah, like class struggle itself is definitely and obviously like even when it's gendered as well, like when people talk about like class struggle, to what extent are they actually like this? What I mean, like worker capitalist, this binary is not necessarily a good one, because it doesn't take into like account the how like people who exist outside of that relation are also central to the production and reproduction of that relation, but how they might not necessarily be included in like traditional narratives about like class. Yeah, Asosa.
Hi. So I was thinking about the question in terms of like what should come first. And I know that both you and Ade have touched on it, but I think like that it's not something that you can just delineate and say, I'm just going to work on racism and I'm just going to work on the patriarchy and I'm just going to work on class struggle. All these things obviously like intersect. So when like the structure of the question, I think instead of like what should come first, like an understanding that these things all need to be done like in tandem with one another, like at the same time. But obviously that feels like extremely overwhelming. And then I remembered this like interview that I read of this like prison abolitionist in the States. And she had as like her like her imagination of liberation was like prisons like abolished, which is obviously anti-racist, anti-capitalist, anti-sexist, blah blah blah. But then she broke it down, and landed on, okay, my life work will be decolonizing education. She got there through the prison to school pipeline, but said that like arrived at like, okay, so this is the work that I will do, and this is the activism that I will be heavily involved with, and will be decolonizing education. Now that's like anti-capitalist, anti-sexist, anti-racist work, because it's feeding into this larger vision of prison abolition, but it's still kind of localized to the education system. So I think it's that kind of awareness of I've imagined almost like the future that I want, and it's this radical notion of prison abolition, and then I've deconstructed to the point where I can work on all of these things conjunctively or at the same time, whilst not being overwhelmed by all of it. It wasn't a book, it was an interview. I'll see if I can find it, but yeah.
I need to leave to my seminar. I'm already 60 minutes late. Thank you so much, Tomi, for doing this event. It was amazing. Like, yeah, I've got so many notes written down. But yeah, thank you all for coming. I'm going to quickly leave, but you can carry on talking about the questions and I'll watch the recording after. Bye.
So do we have any more questions or comments people want to add? Because if not, then also wrap up too, I think. Oh, okay, cool. Thanks for coming, everyone. I've enjoyed it. Hope you did too.
Thanks, everyone. Thank you, Tomi, so much for wonderful contributions. We have two events tomorrow, two Green Week events tomorrow. One of them is environmental impact of fast fashion, and the other one is climate crisis, erase this issue. So it will be on the SU website. It will also be on our social media. But yeah, thanks so much, everyone, for coming.
Thank you, everybody. Bye-bye.